Good afternoon, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, thank you.
Good afternoon, Baroness Neville-Rolfe.
Good afternoon.
Can we turn then to the meeting of the 19th of October 2015 with Second Sight and start with a bit of a run into it by looking at some correspondence beforehand, beginning with UK GI 405300. And if we turn to page 3, please. Sorry, bottom of page 2 and on to page 3. Thank you. We can see there the Ron Warmington email of the 22nd of July to George Freeman that we looked at earlier, the one that says, please look at the following paragraphs of our second report and the statement that Second Sight in 2015 found no evidence of systemic flaws with Horizon is incorrect. If we scroll up, please. We can see that Mr. Warmington, sends that on to David Cameron on the 28th of July. And then scroll up, please. And then on the 4th of August, he sends it to you. Dear Baroness, further to the article written by Tim Ross in this weekend's Sunday Telegraph, and he provides the hyperlink, I've as yet received no acknowledgement from Westminster in regard to my 22nd and 28th of July emails. The possibility seems to exist that Mr. Freeman was inaccurately briefed on the result of our firm's investigation. As stated below, we have concluded that there were, and probably still are, systemic flaws in Horizon. And then if we go to page 1, stop there, thank you. Andrew Bridgen says in an email to your private office of the 5th of August, Dear Lucy, I've been forwarded this email. Perhaps you could advise, given the seriousness of this allegation, that Parliament may have been misled by the Post Office. Your private office send that to SHEX, another one for response. We should aim to send a short response on Friday off the back of the response to Ron Warmington. Do you think you got personally to see this exchange?
I can't be sure. I mean, clearly, I must have known during that August period that Warmington was disputing what Freeman had said.
Can you recall what your reaction was to Mr. Warmington saying that Second Sight's report had been misrepresented in Parliament?
I think I probably sought advice. That's what I normally did if I got something from outside like that. But I think it also came in from the MP. It did, from Andrew Bridgen, who obviously I had a lot of respect for. And so, you know, that meant there was more work to do. That was more work to do. It confirmed my view that we should have somebody else look at this.
Had you by this time read the Second Sight second report to see for yourself whether what had been represented on the basis of briefings in Parliament was correct or incorrect?
At or around this time, I will have got that. I don't recall exactly when the full report was first put in my box, if I'm honest. And remember, this was a holiday period, we were travelling about, etc., etc. But I had taken on board the seriousness of it. And we've spoken earlier about how actually quite difficult it is. You look at the individual paragraphs and it's quite confusing as to exactly what. But there's certainly a problem there, and that I was well aware of.
And did that problem being raised by Second Sight constitute a separate and independent reason for an independent investigation being a priority?
Yeah, I think it certainly helped to stiffen my resolve. But as I've said, I thought the key things were well articulated by the MPs that I'd seen, and indeed by the debate, which we haven't looked at in the House. There was an adjournment debate. a few weeks earlier, bringing all of these things together. And then you've got the second site report as well.
Thank you. That can come
Although
down.
the second site report had been around for a very long time, and as yet, I've still not had a summary of it from the system.
Can you recall what the system's attitude was to your proposal to meet with Second Sight?
Well, basically, they always advised me not to meet with Second Sight on the basis that they were unreliable, they didn't abide by confidentiality, and their report, they seemed to cling on to this key thing that they had found that there was no systematic fault with the system, but they then said that other things that they were doing, you know, they were not straight with, which was a bit confusing to me. And as I said a little bit earlier, I actually really, I found it difficult to know what the key points in the second site report were, particularly when I'd seen the counter stuff from Paul. But what I would say is I think second site were amazing in the way that they kept going. You know, year after year, they produced these reports. They thought that they were onto something. They got, you know, not much sympathy from the powers that be. And yet they kept on trying. And obviously they did engage MPs, which is the right thing to do.
Can we move to closer to the October meeting by looking at UKGI 406142? Excuse me, at the foot of the page, or the bottom half of the page, thank you, an email from Laura Thompson to Andrew Smith of your private office of the 9th of October 2015. And he says, Andrew, I noted down for the team here the non-horizon points from the meeting with the Minister, which I've attached. On the horizon discussion, the main points I took away were as follows. So it seems like you had a meeting at which horizon and non-horizon issues were discussed. And this is Ms. Thompson noting down in the body of the email the main horizon points that she took away. Bullet point 1, Post Office wanted to flag their concerns around the Minister meeting second site. They felt that doing so would risk undermining her independence and distance from the situation, and were also concerned that if news of the meeting were to leak to the media, it could risk individuals withdrawing from the mediation process after considerable efforts by Post Office to get these in the diary. Paula was also concerned that the Minister's meeting might conflict with any meeting Tim Parker decided to have with Second Sight. You noted Paula Vennell's view, but felt it important to make the offer of a meeting to Second Sight and inform James Arbuthnot that you were doing so. You also suggested that the offer should be of a private meeting, excuse me, and should happen quite soon, so that it would take place before Tim Parker invites them to meet. Can you recall what you thought of Post Office's objections to your meeting with Second Sight on the basis that meeting with Second Sight would risk undermining your independence and distance from the situation?
Well, I didn't really think that that was the case. I thought it was quite possible to have a meeting, to hear what they got to say and encourage them to help Tim Parker with his review. So, you know, I'd said I'd see Second Sight as early as July. I'd reiterated that, I think, to James Arbuthnot when I saw him. They all felt Second Sight was very important, and I didn't think that they should stop me, that the Post Office should stop me seeing them. And in fact, even Shex, I think, agreed, perhaps worn down by my insistence, that I should see Second Sight. So I had a meeting with them.
We're going to look at a Shex note in a moment where they, to an extent, in fact, echo the position taken by Post Office, at least initially. Did it occur to you that Post Office's resistance might be motivated by a desire to avoid scrutiny from government?
Well, certainly they were always trying to defend their line. I mean, that seemed to be their approach externally. and they seemed very paranoid about external matters. Indeed, I remember them being very paranoid about Panorama. Obviously, I'd worked in the private sector. I worked for Tesco, which was a company that at that time was very high profile and successful, and we'd had panoramas about ourselves and all the rest of it, and you had to engage. And, you know, the fact, I mean, actually I agree that it should be a private meeting, probably, you know, to try and assuage Paula Venables' concerns, but I did think the right thing was for me to see Second Sight, since they'd been, you know, making a lot of these points over a prolonged period, and I couldn't really see why I shouldn't do that.
You said there that that step might assuage Paula Venables' concerns. Do I take it that you understood that Post Office's approach in this regard was being led by or taken with the approval of Paula Venables?
Yeah, I think, didn't I have a conversation with her about it?
Meeting.
So she felt strongly about it herself, not just her PR people, to actually want to talk to me about it. So she obviously felt strongly, presumably on the advice of lawyers, you know, that this could somehow get in the way of some legal arrangements, mediation, etc., to talk to me about it and explain her concerns. I listened to those concerns. I was careful, obviously, when I saw them, not to say anything, you know, very, trying to think, you know, sort of something that was going to lead to a lot of public rows, because they were obviously worried about that. But I was absolutely determined to see Second Sight, and that I did.
Can we look?
And it was helpful.
Can we look, please, at Sheiks's position? Beis, B-E-I-S, 5013. And note of the 1st of October 2015 from Laura Thompson to you. Advice following your meeting with James Arbuthnot, covering his ask that you meet Second Sight and Sir Anthony Hooper. Recommendation is that you decide whether you'd like to meet Second Sight. If we go down to paragraph 3. Mr. Arbuthnot argued, since you'd received a briefing from Post Office on this matter, it's only fair you should meet Second Sight and hear their side of the story. He invited you to judge for yourself whether Second Sight were as biased and unprofessional as he felt they'd been depicted by the Post Office. For the advantages of agreeing to meet Second Sight would be, and then they're set out, demonstrate the government's listening, agreeing to maintain a positive relationship with James Arbuthnot, assuaging a concern that Second Sight believe that their findings are being misrepresented, and the position that no government action is necessary since the CCRC is considering cases, mediation is ongoing, and Tim Parker is considering the matter with a fresh pair of eyes, would be stronger if you can say you've met Mr. Bridgen, Mr. Arbuthnot and Second Sight. But then there are significant risks, it was said. The operational matter point in A, more stakeholders in B might have a reasonable expectation that the government will opine on the merits. C, a risk of briefing it out over the page 6. Clearly a difficult judgment. Our view is, on balance, you should offer a meeting to Second Sight. The risks of doing so are significant. We believe they can be handled if we're careful and robust in our messaging. 8, if you do decide to meet Second Sight, we suggest a low-key approach with an email from your office to Mr. Warmington. Did you decide, therefore, that you should meet with Second Sight?
I did. I suspect I'd already decided before this memo came up. It's one of the things in government that quite often submissions sort of come along to formalise a view on the one hand, on the other. And they've given me a reasonable, rundown and accepting that I should see second sight. So I'm seeing them. I'm not saying I saw them. The sort of implication is we're just seeing them to show that it was a good thing. I was actually interested in seeing them to hear from them what their view of Horizon was.
You tell us in your witness statement that when Post Office's objections came in, you did not allow Post Office's objections to deflect me.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that how you saw the Post Office's intervention, namely an occasion on which they were seeking to deflect you?
I think that's fair, yes.
Can we turn to what happened at the meeting itself? And the sources for that are unfortunately quite sparse. Look at your witness statement, please, page 39, paragraph 143. Page 39, paragraph 143. It's at the foot of the page. You say, I met Messrs. Warmington and Henderson on the 19th of October 2015. I understand that, regrettably, the department has been unable to locate any minutes or other record of the meeting. I recall listening sympathetically to the issues raised, but I do not remember much of the substance of the meeting. The meeting was certainly not a light bulb moment. I'm confident I would have informed them of the Parker review and that I'd asked Tim Parker to meet them, and I encouraged them to raise these issues with Mr. Parker as part of the review, that review. Is that the limit of your recollection of the meeting of the 19th of October?
Yeah, the specific memory of that meeting, I kind of can remember the room I was in and so on, but unfortunately there's no note of the meeting, which makes it difficult. But what I do remember was, they went through some of their points. Obviously, those were beginning to become familiar with to me. There was a point about contracts, wasn't there? There was a point about Bracknell Remote being able to fiddle about without a footprint, the thing that Mr. McInnes had told me wasn't possible. There were various things which they repeatedly said, but their communication was not of a kind. Very decent people, quite right to keep going, but the communication was not of a kind that created a light bulb moment, and that's my recollection. However, by then, I felt that we were moving towards a solution, and I encouraged them to talk to Tim Parker and to Jonathan Swift about what their views were. I felt that this was the right way to get those concerns looked at and in play and understand, whether the Post Office's long defence was correct or whether the second sight report was correct.
We gleaned something from what happened at that meeting from paragraph 145 of the statement.
Yep.
Because you cross-refer to a letter that you later wrote to Oliver Letwin MP.
Yep.
And you say that of the meeting of the 19th of October, it was a helpful meeting. They raised a number of important points. I suggested they contact Tim Parker to follow them up. He's currently conducting a review and has appointed a QC to advise him. He is currently setting up meetings with the key parties. You're expecting him to update you on his findings in the new year. And I think that's all we know about the meeting of the 19th of October. Did you receive any periodic updates from Mr. Parker about the conduct of his review?
I think during the next three or 4 months I had meetings with him. I don't recall any periodic letters or anything from him, but from time to time, when I was having a meeting on the post office, then Laura Thompson would send me a background brief as to what was happening. And I think I asked for a meeting in January because I think somewhere at some stage or other I was told that he was hoping to have some findings in the new year. So I'd sort of penciled that into my mind as the time to take up the story again.
We can see that from paragraph 150 if we go over the page.
Right. Yeah, there we are, 26th of January. Yeah.
You had a meeting with Mr. Parker. You cross-refer to your own office's or SHEX's note. There were some unrelated Horizon issues discussed, or issues unrelated to Horizon, and he told you on Horizon that Jonathan Swift was, quote, about to report he'd found no systemic problem. Was the first communication in writing that you received from Mr. Parker about the Swift report, or Mr. Parker's review, a letter of the 4th of March 2016?
As far as I know, that was the first that I had anything of substance other than this. It's all slightly about to report, and he found no systemic problem. Obviously, I'd had that from him, which I noted. I mean, the meeting in January was, we had quite a lot of issues to discuss, is my recollection, which probably they probably crowded out any discussion of Horizon.
If we turn then to Mr. Parker's letter to you of the 4th of March, poll 3024913. We can see this is Mr. Parker's letter to you of the 4th of March 2016. He cross-refers to your meeting on the 26th of January and says that he had provided you with an update on the work he had undertaken with the assistance of Messrs. Swift and Knight to review the Post Office's handling of complaints made by sub-postmasters about the operation of the Horizon software system, and sets out in the letter further information about the approach to the review, scope of work undertaken so far, and his initial findings, and outlines his plans to bring the work to a conclusion. But this is a long letter, and we haven't got the space to go through it in detail, but on pages 1 and 2, under the heading Scope of Review, you'll see that he sets out his objectives to review the Post Office's handling of complaints made by sub-postmasters regarding the alleged flaws in Horizon, and to determine whether the processes designed and implemented by Post Office to understand, investigate and resolve those complaints were reasonable and appropriate. Do those terms of reference, or does that stated objective accord with your intention?
I think broadly, I mean, understand, investigate and resolve. The resolve is important too. And then if you go further down the letter, I think there are four areas which seem quite reasonable ones to me. I mean, if you're a minister, you're not general counsel for the department. You're not kind of fiddling about at the margins on terms. What you want is to make sure that somebody sensible is taking things forward. I thought the scope looked all right to me, rightly or wrongly.
And over the page, he says that he decided that the particular focus should be on 4 matters: criminal prosecutions, Horizon system, i.e. the software, support provided through training and helplines, and investigations in the circumstances of specific cases. Can you assist as to whether or not that looked broadly satisfactory to you?
That looked like the right headings to me.
He says, skipping a paragraph, that his advisors were requested and given unrestricted access to documentation. I'll skip over whether that's accurate or not. Numerous meetings were held between them and a range of Post Office staff and employees of Fujitsu, and he sets out the meetings that he had. And then sets out for the rest of this page and onto page 3 the principal findings and recommendations. Did you understand that there existed separately from this document a written report?
Well, certainly not a final report. I mean, I think they might talk about a draft at some point. The way I read this was that they'd made quite a lot of progress and that they'd found these areas where they needed further investigation, which actually, to my mind, matched some of the things that I was concerned about, and so were the MPs. So I thought it was work in progress. And I think I asked for advice from officials, and they sort of said you don't have to do anything at this moment in time. So I was glad that those various areas of further work were being carried out. Obviously, what I didn't know, but you're probably going to come on to ask me about, was this was a slightly rosy summary of the Swift report.
Yeah,
in my view.
Yes, I may choose words differently than slightly rosy. Can we go to page 4, please? Next steps. I've commissioned independent persons to undertake the necessary work. I share your aim that matters should be drawn to a conclusion as soon as possible. I anticipate I'll be in a position to report back on the outcome of the further work during May. I firmly believe the focus and scope of my review to date, together with further work I've now commissioned, will at that time allow me to confirm that the processes decided and implemented by Post Office to understand, investigate and resolve their complaints were reasonable and appropriate, and that there are no further inquiries to be undertaken. 2 other matters. As I've noted, a number of sub-postmasters have made applications to the CCRC. That work is ongoing. Second, the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance is reported to have received funding and no claim has yet been issued. Lastly, last sentence, if you would like to discuss the review report with me, I'd be happy to do so. Given the context of the letter as a whole and that last sentence, did you understand there to exist some freestanding review report?
No, to be honest, I didn't. I assumed that this was kind of work in progress, that they got these extra pieces of work to do, and that I would get a report from the chairman once that work was complete. He mentioned May. There was a board meeting in May, I think somebody told me, and clearly it's the sort of thing that I would have expected the Post Office Board to have a look at. But I was also aware that there were some threads to follow up.
We know that by this time Jonathan Swift had provided Mr. Parker with a copy of his final report. Do you know why Mr. Parker did not state so in his letter?
I've no idea.
Did you discuss, did he mention that there was a final review report when you spoke with him?
I spoke to him in April, I think.
Yeah.
I asked for advice from officials. The officials said did nothing. I then was having a meeting anyway with him in April, one of my quarterly meetings with him. And I don't recall him saying that I've got a final report or anything of the sort that I might have asked for. I recall him saying that the work was ongoing in these 2 or 3 important areas, some of which turned out to be actually quite relevant to the court cases that eventually came through.
Do you know why he did not, without request, provide you with a copy of the report?
I've no idea, but I think he's separately said it was something to do with legal privilege.
Was that the discussion? Was that a discussion that you had at the time, i.e., whether he could or could not provide you with a report?
No.
And if not, why not?
Not that I recall. The letter is, after all, at the beginning it says this is legal privilege, and he sent it to me and it's legal privilege. So what's the difference between a letter, which is legally privileged, and a document that is legally privileged? I'm not sure. But obviously the fact that the 2 didn't match was an issue that I don't know if Tim Parker himself was aware of. He may not have been. But, you know, you have to read the longer report to see whether the summary is... It's not that the summary is wrong. It's more sins of omission.
Did you actively seek a copy of the report?
No, because I didn't have anything to do with the matter after I've had the advice from Laura Thompson not to do anything until April. And then we had a meeting in April. Is there a note of the meeting of April? I don't think there is.
I don't think there is, no.
No, sadly. But what I would have wanted, you know, I'd asked him to do a review. I would have wanted the conclusions of that review. I don't think it's appropriate for ministers to suddenly see drafts of I mean, I'm thinking about other things that I've done as a minister since. You ask for a report and you get the report in due course. You don't sort of have iterations. That sort of undermines the independence of the report almost if it's being sent to the minister in between.
Can we see a little of what was going on internally? Poll 0011 0382. And start with page 2, please. There's an email of the 19th of February from Jane McLeod to Tim Parker under the heading Chairman's Inquiry. As discussed last week, we've considered the best way for you to brief the Minister on the outcome of your inquiry. I expressed concerns that if we were to provide the Minister with a copy of the legal advice you've received from Jonathan Swift, there was a risk that privilege could be lost and the report could become disclosable by BIS through FOIA requests or similar. We've also received a call from the Minister's office in which they sought to understand how the reporting would be undertaken. During the call, it became apparent that BIS officials are also concerned as to the legal status and positioning of any report received from you. Those last two sentences suggest that people in your private office were seeking to understand how the report or reporting of the outcome of the review would be undertaken, and they said that BIS officials were concerned about the status and positioning of the report. Was that something in which you had any involvement?
Well, A, I had no involvement, and B, having read, obviously I was very concerned to read this at the time when the inquiry sent me all these papers, because it suggested my private office were working behind my back and not giving me full information. But I don't think that the Minister's office reference is correct. I think in the Minister's office they mean Ms. Thompson. They're thinking they're getting muddled up between my private secretaries and Ms. Thompson, who didn't work for me. She worked for Shex. And you'd have to ask them, what they felt about all of that. This is just the time when we got the EU referendum starting, isn't it? So, busy time for ministers.
The rest of the chain deals with the drafting of the letter, which eventually became the 4th of March letter 2016. Were you ever made aware, prior to Mr. Parker sending the letter of 4th of March 2016, that Post Office had discussed, either with Shex or your office, their intended approach of sending a letter that was claimed to be a summary of the review's findings?
No.
Were you ever made aware that the full review report was not to be provided? It was said in order to preserve privilege over it.
Well, certainly not at that stage. I think probably never. I mean, when I stopped doing it, we'll come on to this, no doubt, I thought the sort of follow-up work was continuing, because there was one or two quite important bits of work by Deloitte and others. But then it all got muddled up with the court, the general court case by the sub-postmasters group. But at this stage, I would have assumed that I would get the full report in due course with recommendations as to what to do, and recommendations on how we communicated that to Arbuthnot and others, and how we communicated it to the world at large. After all, my concern came from the points that they'd raised with me a few months earlier, which I obviously continued to be worried about.
In his witness statement, I'm not going to display it now, and that document can come down from the screen, The cross-reference is WITN 00690100, and it's paragraph 93. Tim Parker says, quote, Baroness Neville-Rolfe and her office was made aware of the approach being taken to the distribution of the SWIFT review to seek to maintain legal privilege.
Do you know what date that was?
He doesn't cross-reference it. He simply says, you and your office were made aware of the approach being taken to the distribution of the SWIFT review to seek to maintain legal privilege. Is that correct?
Well, as I said, when I looked at this earlier, I wasn't convinced it was my office, and I don't recall my office coming in to say to me, you can't have this document.
And so either that's a mistake in the email, which refers to your office, and it's meant to mean SheEx,
Yeah.
or your office had kept something from you.
Correct. Why I said when was it was obviously by the time you get to sort of July, it's then unclear who's going to be minister, because we'd had a big change of Secretary of State, and I lost the Post Office brief in that carve-up. And they seemed to think, even before I lost it, that I might lose it if you read the paperwork.
Okay. You tell us in your witness statement that the first time you saw the SWIFT report was earlier this year as a result of the inquiry.
Yeah, it was during the inquiry when the documents came through. And obviously I was very interested to see it. Obviously the letter I'd seen, but not the SWIFT report.
Did you compare the report with the letter?
In preparing for this inquiry, I did.
And what view did you take in comparing?
Well, I took the view that it was a bit, put a positive gloss.
I think it's paragraph 166.
I think I've dealt with it in my inquiry. So there was a generality that it seemed to be saying there wasn't too much of a problem, in spite of the fact that there was extra areas to be explored. And then there was stuff that particularly concerned me about how prosecutors had tried to do deals with people who were being prosecuted by getting them to accept false accounting, as a quid pro for dropping theft charges. And that came out, I think that's 100 to 109 of the SWIFT review.
If you look at, if we display it on the screen, because there's a quite neat summary, your witness statement at paragraph 45, sorry, page 45, paragraph 166.
Yeah.
Page 45, paragraph 166. You say, even more importantly, I now see, having had access to the SWIFT report, that Mr. Parker's reassuring summary of the report was materially misleading. Specifically, it failed to make any reference to the important points made by Mr. Swift in paragraphs 145 to 147, which concern remote access and directly undermine information provided to ministers and in turn Parliament, and indicate serious historic and ongoing concerns as to Post Office's compliance with its disclosure obligations in relation to criminal prosecutions and convictions. This contradicts the assurance given in the second paragraph of the criminal prosecution section of Mr. Parker's letter. Quote, I'm satisfied the Post Office has adopted a proper approach to disclosure such that it satisfies its duty of disclosure as a prosecutor. All this touches on my key concern, which was that postmasters should be able to secure justice through the CCRC process. Similarly, whilst it refers to further work commissioned in relation to Post Office's tactic of charging theft and false accounting, it did not refer to the important and strongly critical findings in paras 100 to 109. These specific findings should have been brought to my attention. I was surprised and disappointed to discover years later that Mr. Swift's findings were not disclosed as part of any criminal or civil proceedings. I do think this is nothing short of scandalous. What action would you have taken if you had been provided with the raw material, i.e. the Swift report itself?
Well, I would have read the report, I would have seen those paragraphs and other paragraphs, and I would have wanted to take steps to make sure that this duty of disclosure was implemented. I mean, when I came in, I asked about documents. I was told by the MPs that people were destroying files. I tried to make sure that that didn't happen. And yet here we've got an instance where things are not being disclosed. And I think you found, Mr. Beer, as part of your other hearings with Fujitsu and others, that there was material. In fact, some of the Deloitte stuff was referred to in Mr. Swift's report, but not in the covering letter, as far as I can recall. So what you've got is some really quite explosive material in that detailed report, which should have been referred to in the letter to me, in my opinion.
Well, in particular, would you agree, since the relevant Deloitte report was then 2 years old in the tooth, and that report had itself been provided to a number of senior executives, and a summary of it had been provided to the board?
Absolutely, and there was almost a suggestion that that was new material, I think, that Swift had got hold of. Sorry, we haven't got up the Swift report, but for those involved in the inquiry, I think it makes extremely good reading because it summarises a lot of the background very well. And frankly, it would have been good, good for everybody to have had that summary if it made available much more broadly, including, I would suggest, to the board of the post office.
To what extent did you have any dealings with Jane McLeod?
Well, I think she came to the meeting on the 6th of August with Paula Venables. I think that's my only dealing with her that I'm aware of.
And therefore, would that be an insufficient basis to form a view or impression of her?
It would. And I know she hasn't given you evidence, which is a pity, because obviously a lot of the work she did touched on these issues that are so important to the sub-postmaster.
Exactly.
And the firing line on all of this.
And Mr. Parker said that it was Miss McLeod who told him that he couldn't disclose the Swift report to you.
Well, there you are.
Can we move forwards, please, to a draft letter, as I think it rightly is called, of the 21st of June 2016, and turn up paragraphs 180 to 181 of your witness statement, which are on page 48. You tell us that you've had sight of an unsigned draft letter of the 21st of June from Tim Parker to you. In it, Mr. Parker says that Post Office has received very strong advice from leading counsel that the work being undertaken under the aegis of my review should come to an immediate end and instead address the issues through equivalent work taken forward in the litigation. I've therefore instructed that the work being undertaken pursuant to my review should now be stopped. You say the first time you saw this draft letter was in preparation from the inquiry. A FOIA request said that they couldn't locate any information that the letter was in fact sent to the department. You're told by the department that it has no record of receiving it, and you're confident you didn't see it at the time. Is that right?
That's right. I was amazed when I saw it, to be honest.
How, therefore, in the absence of that letter, was the work that was outstanding from the Swift review that was summarised in the 4th of March letter rounded off for you?
Well, it wasn't really rounded off. There was, in the briefing that I got in July, they said, well, they were looking at how the Swift review stuff fitted in with the civil litigation, which I think was perfectly reasonable to look at the two alongside each other. But obviously I never had any advice on what then happened as a result of that. What I discovered, after a couple of years ago, or whenever, partly when looking, I think, the inquiry, And partly I discovered that, the Swift review had basically been buried, which I was quite surprised by, because when you have legal cases, there's huge processes of discovery. I mean, I know this from my background at Tesco. There are huge processes of discovery for documents, and you have to, your lawyers have to make sure that things are made available that may help, the people bringing the case. So I described it as scandalous, but I also think it's very, very surprising. And I don't know, obviously you'd have to ask the counsel that it was involved in that litigation, why it wasn't made available to anybody.
Thank you. That can come down. You make a number of observations in your statement by way of reflections. You say that government cannot function if ministers are unable to trust the information that they are provided with by officials. You say that you were, by mid-August, fighting SHIEX, that you had lost confidence in the quality of SHIEX advice, that they were trying to obstruct or shut down your efforts to get to grips with the issues, that you had lost confidence in your civil servants on matters relating to Post Office and Horizon. Did you ever escalate any of those matters to the Secretary of State?
I think I told the Secretary of State in August that I was unhappy and that therefore I was calling for a review by Tim Parker, and that my recollection is that he supported that it could get to the bottom of things, in a reasonable way. And then, I think at updates which are unrecorded because of the problem of lack of records, I might well have mentioned my concerns and, getting stuff done on this issue. And I think I had an update with Mr. Russell at some point, who was the CEO. I think you showed me a piece of paper just before I came in this afternoon.
Yes.
Which actually is quite helpful, because for the first time I can see I did raise it with the Permanent Secretary as an issue. Perhaps you're going to show me that.
In fact, somebody else is going to show you that, and they
Fine.
asked that you be shown the piece of paper, so I'll let them.
Thank you. Let them ask me. Yeah.
I'll let them do it. Were there the alternative possibilities of raising your concerns with the Permanent Secretary, Martin Donnelly, the Chief Executive of SHIEX, Mark Russell, or the Chair of the SHIEX Advisory Board, Robert Swanwell?
Well, if you look at a lot of the papers, they're copied to the Permanent Secretary, they're copied to the Minister's office, they're copied to Mr. Russell. And in the civil service, that's, I used to be a civil servant, that's the way senior civil servants like Permanent Secretaries get an eye on things. They get a lot of paper that they sift through. And as it happens, I did recall having a bit of a moan to Martin Donnelly, and actually he did something about it, as this document which we're going to come on to discuss shows. Obviously, I felt happier once Tim Parker had taken on the mantle of bringing in independent advisor to look at the complications. Although we've focused on the negative from SHIEX, you have to bear in mind that in my post office brief, I was looking at lots of different things: transformation, the accounts, visiting post offices, what was their strategy going to be going forward, so they didn't have to have so much taxpayers' money, but kept the network, which was so vital to local communities, going. So, it wasn't all negative, but clearly on this Horizon thing, they seem to be particularly narrow. And as I've said several times, when I asked for detailed advice On the second site report, towards the end of August, I didn't get a submission, as I should have done, outlining the various accusations and what we, as the department, thought about those. I got a defence document from the post office.
Baroness Neville-Rolfe, thank you very much for answering my questions. That's all of the questions that I propose to ask. There are, I think, a number of core participants that wish to ask questions. I know that Mr. Henry has 15 minutes or so. Maybe if we start with those, that will take us to the break at 3 o'clock.
Good afternoon, Baroness Neville-Rolfe. It's often said that openness is the first casualty of a project that is in serious trouble. And you wouldn't disagree with that observation, would you, given your experience with the Post Office?
No, and generally, obviously I come from a background in business where your working assumption has to be that, things do become public and it's better to...
Exactly. One paragraph among many, but early on in your statement was striking, and it was your paragraph 5, which reads, I would like to emphasize that a large number of documents which would have been helpful in preparing this statement, such as the minutes of several meetings and my ministerial diary, have not been made available to me. This is perhaps because in 2016 the shareholder executive and its staff and records were transferred out of BIS to become part of the newly formed UKGI, and in the same year BIS was merged into a new department. And this is a refrain at paragraphs 31, 42, 101, 143 and 177 of your witness statement. Given your experience in government, how disturbing is this loss of data, which appears to be endemic within the UKGI on this subject? Do you regard this as something which has hampered you?
I certainly do. I think it's very unfortunate. And if you look at one or two of the documents, it says at the bottom, it isn't the private office's responsibility to keep documents, it's your responsibility as the advising division, which I found quite surprising. I mean, more latterly, I've been a Cabinet Office Minister, and I asked my staff what they did about records, and they explained that every 3 months they send off a pile of papers to the archives.
Right. So this appears to be unusual.
So it may be that it's unusual. I mean, it's not something that I can really comment on. It's more for the civil servants in charge of records. But it's certainly been very unhelpful for me, and I think for other ministers, that they haven't been able to see the contemporaneous notes. Has one forgotten important things? We've all tried our hardest, I'm sure, but it's quite difficult.
Right. I now want to go to a document which is UKGI 000-19859. And while it's been put up on the screen, one of the themes that has dominated the inquiry has been the constant refrain, we had every reason to believe Horizon was robust. We were told this by the Post Office. We were told this by Shecs. You, however, did not believe that, did you, Baroness Neville-Rolfe? Because in this document, you expressed the view that it was probably one of HM government's IT debacles. And we can scroll down. We have Richard Callard at the top, but then it's from Tim McInnes. And do you see the second bullet point? As she, that's you, Baroness Neville-Rolfe, mentioned before, she thought Horizon was another example of a government IT debacle and that innocent sub-postmasters were the victims. And then Mr. McInnes says, and this is the 12th of June 2015, clearly this is wholly untrue in 2 respects, probably untrue in a third. The general tone of this, I don't want to distract you, is slightly derisory or slightly mocking. but I don't want to distract you with that. But what I want to explore with you is why you thought that, why you harboured the suspicion that Horizon was another government IT debacle. Would I be right in suspecting that part of your scepticism no doubt came from your personal experience in business?
I think so, but also my experience of government IT systems. You know, there'd been police computers, various different IT things, and government do seem to find, or did seem to find, you know, getting IT systems right very difficult.
Very difficult.
And, you know, a key to having good systems, it's been my experience, partly as a non-exec in other companies, but also a little bit when I was at Tesco, is you've got to have really good induction, training, helplines, and learn from mistakes as you go along, because it is inherently difficult bringing in IT systems. And I have to say that the Horizon system, if you look at the Second Sight report, had to do an awful lot of stuff.
Yes.
And I'm sure that the IT providers will have known that. They were obviously experienced IT providers in lots of areas. But, you know, I suppose it's fair to say this was very early on, and it probably irritated officials, but I came in with a certain questioning of IT, and I would have wanted to hear why there weren't the sort of problems that we'd seen in some of these other areas, from my recollection of when I worked in government.
Yes. And of course, you'd served in government in the 1990s, and you'd served in government
Exactly.
from I think it's right, 2015 onwards.
Well, until I went to Tesco in 97, I worked in government latterly in the Cabinet Office and in the business department and in number 10. Then I had 15 and a half years in business. Then I joined the Lords and I became a minister in 2014.
Yes.
And then I was a minister for about 3 years. And then after the referendum, I went on the back benches, and then I've been back being a minister. So I'm quite unique in having had such a lot of different experience, business, civil service, and several ministerial departments. So I suppose I thought it was a fair comment to talk about IT debacles, even if shareholder executive obviously found that exceptional.
And so therefore it's within your direct knowledge that government had suffered notorious problems with major IT systems for decades.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned the police. There was also, I think it's right, the Inland Revenue had difficulties with IT problems.
They did, and especially moving to self-assessment. Although actually in time they sorted them out, so it was very bad to start with, and then gradually It got better. I mean, I think that's the problem. You get a lot of bugs and things to start with, and so you've got to have really good support and training and helplines and help people.
And an openness and a commitment to get it right as opposed to covering it up.
Absolutely.
I mean, this, of course, notoriously, Horizon grew out of the problems that the DSS had with it, had it not?
I don't think I know the early background to Horizon, but that sounds quite likely, because after all, there was this question of making payments to individual benefit claimants. Yeah.
So to this refrain, we were being told that it was robust. You certainly weren't gulled by that, and the wool wasn't pulled over your eyes by that, hence your scepticism and the fact that you were probing.
I tried to probe, but I also tried to take advice, because the civil service has to work on the basis that officials set things out in a cool and sensible way for the attention of ministers, offering them options, considering what needs to be done in the public interest. I know that because obviously, to some extent, I had residual civil service values in my DNA.
Could I now move to the role of the civil service? Because you once said in the House of Lords, "My Lords, having had previous responsibility for the Post Office, I am very well aware that ministers are advised to stand firm on seemingly solid grounds only for it to become clear in the long term that that is not defensible. Now, you may have heard the Right Honourable Pat McFadden's suggestion regarding a new body to investigate potentially rogue arm's-length businesses. What would you suggest, however, be done about potentially reckless advisors and officials who seem to have lost their objectivity and upon whom you relied?
Right, well, that's quite a big question. I mean, off the cuff, a couple of points. One, I think it's incredibly important to have the right people in jobs. So you need good performance culture, you need to hire the right people, you need to give them feedback when they're not there. I think as an ex-civil servant, I mean, the role of the permanent secretary is also important. So if you think about financial matters, if ministers ask civil servants to spend money that they think is poor value for money, then the Perm Sec can object, and they send a memo that, there has to be a instruction from the permanent secretary to from the minister to the permanent secretary, saying, I, the minister, think it's right to do this, even though you've expressed some reservations. I mean, rather than setting up a whole new department to do this sort of thing on the off chance that there might be, I hope never repeats of this sort of thing, my only thought is there some way that you could, bring that kind of thing into play, and people would then know that if there was a problem, I mean, obviously you can always go to the Secretary of State, but is there some role of the permanent secretary? I don't know exactly what Pat McFadden said. I'm sure
so
he was trying to be helpful.
Is there anyone you could have depended upon independently at the time to validate the truth and honesty of important ministerial statements before you made them, to prevent the mischief that you were speaking of in the House of Lords, that ultimately those statements have become untenable?
I mean, the truth is that as a politician, you are extraordinarily aware that anything you say on the public record in the House, whether it's the Lords or the Commons, has to be accurate. And there are well-established processes for correcting the record if you have to do that. I mean, that arose during COVID, of course, didn't it? I mean, the answer is you have to try and find a way of getting at the truth, and then if you find out that the truth hasn't been communicated, then you have to correct the record. I think if the Win is thinking about what might be done for the future, and I think you've got a further sort of whole module on this, you need to just have a think about, how this would work in practice and whether there would be perverse effects to bringing in a whole new sort of tier. I mean, the key thing in organisations where you've got people who aren't very good, what happens is you move them on. In the civil service appointments are rightly for the civil service rather than for the ministers, to avoid, inappropriate, or have people having their friends in the wrong places. And I think that is valuable, that independence of the civil service. So I think you need to look at this particularly in the light of Shex, where you were bringing in a lot of people from outside the civil service. And it might be that you could do more to help them, to induct them, to make sure that their the reports are looking properly at what might go wrong.
Could I come to that? Because, of course, one such recruit was Mr. Callard, and final document for you, Baroness, is UKGI 000 17443. And this is an email that Mr. Callard sent on the 18th of November 2015. And could we go to Mr. Callard's email, which is, I think, on page 2? It's the one that begins, it's 18th of November 2015 at 18:25. Yes, thank you very much. This is in response to you expressing some dismay with the way you had been informed of matters. And this is Mr. Callard stating that he believed that you've been a bit harsh. The problem is we cannot deliver what she, that's you, Baroness, wants: a green-locked GIB and a post office without a perceived but non-existent IT problem. Bit harsh from my perspective. We've kept a lid on the latter, he says. So in other words, we've kept a lid on the post office. Baroness, given everything that you instituted, did you want Richard Callard to keep a lid on the sub-postmaster's dispute with the post office?
No, I wanted to get to the bottom of the matter and
So,
the truth of the matter.
Exactly. So what he's done there is it's precisely the opposite of what you wanted, isn't it?
It does seem to be. Obviously, I hadn't seen this at the time, and I had taken steps to say that I would like more political handling, as you can see from the subsequent memo,
Exactly.
in this area and in the Green Investment Bank, which was also, as I said earlier, involves people from outside who come in, and that's great that they come in and bring their expertise, but it's also important that you follow the values of
Governance.
of transparency, truth, and governance.
Yes. Thank you very much, Baroness.
Thank you, Mr. Henry. So we have our break now, Mr. Beer.
So can I just check with the all participants how long they will be?
Yes,
Because if it's a short period of time, then it might be that we can survive without a break.
Yeah, sure.
One call participant, 5 minutes.
Then we will have our 5 minutes.
Thank you.
I don't know if you
afternoon.
can hear me. I represent a large number of core participants, sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses, who are affected by this scandal. And Mr. Beer asked you about your reflections. Mr. Henry took you to some correspondence involving Mr. Callard. I have a couple of very brief further questions. You've said in your evidence that you believe that you were being misled. You've also said that you believe that the Sheks and Post Office are working together to try to deflect you. We have that email where Mr. Callard was trying to arrange a meeting with Post Office officials to talk about a forthcoming meeting with you and the Chief Executive and to gauge your mood and what it is that you wanted to do. So they were colluding and talking about you behind your back, effectively. It's right, isn't it, that your experience is that Sheks were far too close to the Post Office?
I think they weren't taking an alternative sources of information. I mean, clearly they were going to have to be close to the Post Office because the Post Office had all the facts on individual cases.
But they lost their objectivity, I think.
My worry was that they'd lost their objectivity in all of that. That was at the heart of the problem, I think.
I just want to clarify a point. It may have already been made, but it seems to be quite an important point. You made a distinction at 12:20 this afternoon that Sheks was made up of commercial people and not classic civil service officials. Do you think things would have been different from what you experienced had the body charged with oversight of the Post Office been composed of classic civil service officials?
I'm not sure that they would have had the expertise to hold shareholdings in things like the banks and the Post Office and things without commercial expertise. I'm not against the commercial expertise. I think what I would saying is that that's not necessarily sufficient. I mean, having said that, there were some, Susanna Story, who I think you're seeing later, who I know from DCMS, she was a civil servant of the classic kind. So there was a mixture. But I'm not sure the civil service is good. I remember when I went to work in the private sector, the whole of my first month was induction, and I had 3-hour meetings with all the key directors, 3-hour meetings, which I couldn't understand. The difference when you go to work in the civil service is you're lucky to get a 15-minute meeting just to say hello to people. Because it's very different, and what you have to do in the public sector is a bit different, I think it's very, very important that they should understand that. And that obviously was an understanding by Mr. Killard. He felt that it was important to keep the lid on, but obviously as a civil servant, it's not only keeping the lid on, it's also making sure that you're doing the right thing.
In terms of public duties and serving the public, did you perceive there to be any ethical difference between Czech's officials and the rest of the civil servants who you worked with?
I don't think we discussed ethics, but they obviously took a very narrow, focused view linked to their duties in terms of the commercial and strategic vision for the pole, and didn't seem to focus so much on classic governance issues like the risk from these prosecutions, which would be something that as a civil servant you're always looking at the downside as well as the commercial opportunity. I mean, having said that, they were trying to move forward. Paula Venables, to give her credit, reduced the deficits in the post office. So the post office must have been doing something right at that time.
Finally, Baroness, this narrow view, this lack of focus on more public interest type problems such as prosecution, is that, on your evidence, the fault in the system which prevented you from being able to carry out your ministerial duties in terms of receiving the right information?
I think it was also to do with the particular individuals, because I gave them lots of openings saying, what's in the second sight report. If I had been my previous self sitting in that seat, I would have gone away and I would have read the whole of the second sight report, and I would have gone through all of the negative findings, and I would have then wanted to do my own job, understanding what was right and what was wrong. That wasn't done. What they did was take advice from the post office, because they felt the post office could give the answers. And that isn't what you do. As a good civil servant, you look at different, you look at different sources.
I think that's answered my question. I don't have any more. I haven't other questions for you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Baroness, are you a supporter of arm's length bodies?
As I think I said in my statement, I think they do have value. If you think about government owning things like banks, the post office, it's not really possible for ministers to be responsible on a day-to-day basis. Therefore, the arm's length system was set up. However, as I said, I think in my statement, it's extremely important. It's almost even more important that you have really good people engaged. And I think people need to understand that when you are the board member on an ALB representing the government, you have a very important duty. And actually, it's quite similar private equity, where they own a big stake in a company, which I've had experience of. They put a director on the board, and that director, I can tell you, is always asking questions and thinking about, as it were, the owner's needs, both financial and non-financial. So does that answer my questions, Owen?
Well, it does. I'm just wondering how easy it is, actually, to find this supercharged person who is able to always distinguish between his or her duties as a member of the board, i.e. his or her duties to the company, and at the same time represent a shareholder who is not necessarily aligned with all the objects of the company, because the shareholder will have things like, for example, the social value of keeping post offices open in their head. And so I'm just wondering how easy or not, as the case may be, it is to find this person who is able to perform these as I would see it, extremely difficult tasks.
I think it is difficult, but I think if you have clear objectives, which all understand, and those are kind of trained in at the beginning through induction, and my experience, which is quite limited of private equity, is that the people that they put on boards to represent them, you know, have sort of central, if you like, central training. They're selected to be able both to sit on boards and to take an independent view. And it may be that the cadre of people that we have in checks, which is now UKGI, you know, have to have that kind of support. I have to say, you know, I'm obviously not up to date on what they do, but it is a very interesting, important area, because you've got to get the mixture of these operations moving forward commercially, but reflecting the public sector value, sometimes the social value, sometimes obviously value for money, which matters as well, and which the external people can really help with. It's difficult. I don't envy them their tasks, Owen.
All right, thank you very much. Well, I'm very grateful to you for making a very detailed witness statement and for answering a good many questions during the course of most of today. So again, thank you very much for your witness statement and for appearing to give oral evidence.
Thank you.
Right, Mr. Beer, that it for the day?
It is. We return tomorrow with Margot James.
Yeah.
Tomorrow being a Wednesday, might I suggest that we start at 10:05 so that we don't have the interruption of the fire alarm?
I don't think I need much of a temptation to start a little later, Mr. Beer.
Okay, 10:05 it is. Thank you very much, sir.
Fine.